Hello, I'm Frank Mills. I was born in 1928, and this seat describes some parts of history which are no longer with us today. I've spent my whole life in the Brunswick Valley. In fact, my ancestors arrived at Brunswick Heads in 1860. Brunswick Heads was the last little river to be explored by Steve King and the two Boyd brothers way back in April of 1849. And when they arrived here, the two other rivers, both the Richmond and the Tweed, had been settled. And they wanted to open up this little valley and little river. The seat which you are sitting on now, well, the sleepers were used in the days on the railway lines. They were needed. It was before the days of ever making them out of concrete. But they had to be chopped out of the forest with a huge broad axe. When I was around 20 years of age, I went to the forest. My role was to work with a mate in timber cutting. In those days, you worked in pairs. When you were chopping a tree, there was a left-hander on one side, which I was, and a right-hander on the other. Where you're leaning your back on is a peg and rake, a saw. A little band's been placed along it by the sculptor for your protection, so that the teeth won't stick into your neck. But after the sleepers were cut, in the early days, they could be hauled out by the bullocks or small crawler tractors. That's me there, Jimmy. The back of this seat has 5 bullock bows. These bows were pinned down from the yoke, which went across the necks of 2 bullocks. Those big hooks you can see on the seat are the hooks which hooked into the ring of the yoke and carried it back past the body of the pair of bullocks onto the next pair. There are other interesting elements. Where the person on the right-hand end of the seat is sitting is the end of a plough. Your arm can rest on it. Well, those ploughs were pulled in the early days by the bullocks or the horses. That was how they opened our country up. You will find parts of another large cultivator, Tines. This one was parked, and a man willingly from Brunswick Heads gave it to the sculptor to include in the plough also. Beside the plough, you will see a large old fire nozzle that the firemen in those days put out the house fires with, in particular, because the old times they were all timber. It was all fire prone. And this seat is painted bushfire red. So you will notice all the vehicles were in those days. But in those days, there were fire protection officers also, and I was in charge of that, extending to the Clarence River and up to Tenterfield and the state boundary. This was back in the late 1960s when I took over as the first full-time fire control officer of Byron and Tweed Shires. If you were to look around from this seat you're sitting on and look out towards Readings Bay, that's on your left hand. Follow the street, Tweed Street down, and you'd see a beautiful bay. It wasn't real deep, but it was quite deep enough to handle schooners which were anchored there. It was long before the rock walls were built, but prior to that, that was where the schooners used to anchor. They were known as the flour schooners. They brought the supplies, in those days they were called rations, in for the people further up the valley. These days I produce books, short stories about what went on in the early days, how people lived and the different and rather humorous ways they went about things. So that was a little bit about the seat where you're sitting and how times and the scenery has changed.